My name is Aiden Kivisto. I'm the manager of community development at the YMCA of Cumberland, and our office is focused on homelessness prevention and housing support. And so that's where I've started my work, but our work grows, and so I'm looking at being a nonprofit housing provider in Cumberland County, and so that's our next project. Definitely be talking about the work that we do in Cumberland County and kind of the trends that we're seeing there. It'll be the start of our service-based count that's happening in Cumberland between November 1st and November 30th. So I won't be able to share too much data about that, but I am looking forward to talking about the work we're doing there, as well as the upcoming Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, and my work as the board chair for the new Nova Scotia Nonprofit Housing Association. I feel like I'm a little bit late to the game when it comes to that, being that I've only lived in Nova Scotia for the last year and a half now. But it was I believe we're into year 3, build together process with the Coady Institute and St. FX University. And so the Community Housing Transformation Center and the province of Nova Scotia were big funders in the creation of this organization. And so back in October 2022, there was a founding meeting which I was in attendance to. And from the founding meeting, the values and mission were formed. And from there, collaborative teams were formed. And so those collaborative teams worked from October until, I think, into March. And into March, that's when we were able to file for our papers of incorporation to start the nonprofit. And so those collaborative teams focused on lots of different topics, including programs and services, capacity building, different ways in which what membership would look like, and what would we be providing as an association to our membership. And so I was the chair of the interim board in between our collaborative teams and filing our papers of incorporation. And so once we were able to file, then we had our AGM on July 28th. And I was elected board chair. And so that brings us to now, where we now have an executive director who I'm happy to share is Trish McCourt, who was previously the executive director at the Tri-County Women's Centre in Yarmouth. Goals of the organization is to really be community voice up. And so taking the voices from all the different informal and formal housing coalitions and groups and networks that are across the province, especially in rural areas, and bringing their voices together to advocate at the provincial level as well as the federal level for continued support for nonprofit housing, as well as building the capacity of each of those organizations to continue to do the work. A lot of the informal groups and even formal groups that are corporations, charities, things like that, need support. Everybody needs support. All of the money is behind barriers of grants. And if you don't have the capacity as an informal group, then we're hoping as the association we can connect people with those resources. Within the informal housing coalitions and networks, there is shared housing that exists already. And it's a relatively new topic for me, introduction for me, being that my work in housing is shallow to this point, but immensely in depth of, how great of a problem is across the country, as well as especially in rural areas. And being that Nova Scotia is primarily rural, these kinds of networks are kind of what have to be struck up to support people that are looking for housing and don't have housing. And when it comes to shared housing, although that may not include leases, it may not include formal living arrangements, that exists in all different ways already. We know that in Cumberland County, that shared housing exists on different levels that includes trade. So whether that be money, people themselves, drugs, food, whatever the arrangement is, that it's already existing there. And so, from an association's perspective, is there's a lot of work happening that we don't have descriptors for. We don't have. It remains invisible, let's say. And so it's hard to measure and say what the resources are in a community or how things are happening or what the relationships are without knowing that they exist. Even if we think about an excess of housing, and that I think lends itself to looking at the definition of what is someone who's appropriately housed or someone who's overhoused or underhoused, right? So the excess of housing kind of speaks to that spectrum of, kind of defining what that looks like for somebody. So an excess of housing for, a single person might be a 2-bedroom apartment, or it might be a 4-bedroom house, right? So whatever that excess is, or if someone's, deemed overhoused, by having someone come in and share that space with them informally, yeah, that whether it happens with a written agreement or a word agreement, a handshake, which is often what happens. You know, the issue that what we run into is sometimes with some high need, high acuity clients that we know about in Cumberland County is that are they able to make those decisions on their own? Do they have capacity? And what do those relationships really look like? And if there's issues, then are they being mediated, or is this person losing their housing? So I think there's so much because um, it's not formalized, it's not defined. Let's say as part of the Canadian homelessness observation. It's not part of those groups of definitions that it really kind of speaks to how maybe all these pieces really need to be measured and really need to be discussed. So, like I said, although it's a relatively new concept for myself, it's happening. We know it's happening. Well, I think, like most of Canada, Nova Scotia is an aging province. And so, and a lot of people leave Nova Scotia and go west. And so I think that there's definitely this abundance of people that are overhoused, or people that have space and availability that also may not have all their needs met, whether that be a social need or a mental health need, or what have you, a financial need. Any of those things, I think, can align with someone else who needs those things and may have those resources that person needs. And I think it would be worthwhile exploring this as a service, and obviously you always want to try and match the resource to the person in need, right? And that's what we do through our coordinated access, which is the one door into all the housing resources. So I could see this easily being a big part of what we can do through coordinated access, and work collaboratively in more rural areas to look at what kind of a service would look like for that. I think there's room to develop something there that can connect people that want to house share or want to fulfill one of their needs, and also help somebody else out, and someone who's willing to fulfill that for them. So Coordinated Access is a national program that's federally funded through the Reaching Homes funding, which is from the 2017 National Housing Strategy. And so this system is meant to be one intake and one door to all of the housing resources in any area. Now in New Brunswick, it's very full functioning. In Nova Scotia, it's functioning in different communities, but they're not all connected the same way that they are in New Brunswick. Although their 3 major cities are all connected through their homelessness individual and family information system, HIFIS, and all of their programs can talk, so that they can see if somebody has been to St. John, or maybe they're in Fredericton now, or maybe they've moved to Moncton. So you can kind of track and see, okay, is this person still homeless? Is this person found permanent housing? And so the idea is that we can keep track of how many people are actually housing insecure and homeless. And so, like I said, this program is launched across the country in different provinces. It's I think per area, you're going to find that there's different housing resources that are available. When I think of Cumberland County, there's only so many resources. And I think, like everywhere else, pricing is high, availability is low, and a lot of landlords kind of take advantage of people at this time because of the way the market is, which is why everyone's talking about how can we build more, how can we build faster, how can we get people housed, why shared housing is another unique solution to kind of fill those gaps. I think that one's a hard one to answer when it's something that I think people wouldn't identify it as that. They might be doing it. They might be accommodating somebody like boarding, you know, but they wouldn't call it shared housing. So I think it's hard to answer that without really kind of putting it to community. Say like, this is what shared housing is. Like, how is this happening in your community? Like, without asking that question of different communities, I think it's kind of hard to answer. We know some clients that work with us in our office that, let's say, are either in and out of institutions like criminal justice system or hospital, things like that, that often have to rely on the best resources that they have for themselves, whether that be their bodies or things that they could do, or, whether it be labor or whether it be um, um, drugs, substances, what have you. Whatever they have, whatever resources they have, they try to use them to the best of their ability to survive. So we know of a client that hasn't come to reach out to our services in a few months, being that they have somewhat secure housing, but it's a shared housing arrangement. But we're aware that there's a sex trade happening, but that person, because they've been able to do that, have a secure bed to sleep in every night, and not be exposed to the elements. So, despite what anybody might think about that relationship is working for both of those people, whatever it may be. But and oftentimes, maybe we don't think of familial relationships as shared housing, but when both people are relying on each other to support the household, although it's not two people who don't know each other, there's always familial ties that can be exhausted, where people end up unhoused because of social network burnout. I think some effort around organizing accountability, because you would never want to see somebody being taken advantage of unfairly and not have any kind of recourse for that person, especially if there's no lease or there's no other legal, standard formal legal agreement. And so that can leave a lot of people vulnerable, whether it's the person who has the resource or the person who needs the resource. Either one is vulnerable in those situations. And so attaching it to an organization, I think, would be smart, especially if it helped facilitate different kind of conflict resolution, or even just accountability for each of the parties. Well, you have to have accountability, in a way that landlords that take advantage of people don't necessarily have accountability right now, being that tenants are so housing insecure that if they go to the tenancy board saying, hey, I'm having issues, then if they win, they've ruined the relationship with the landlord. If they lose, they've ruined the relationship with the landlord, and they may be even more at risk of losing their housing because of that. And that's just the nature of, again, the market. Like I said, there's a lot of really, compassionate people, that probably would be interested in something like that. But again, if it's not defined, if it's not talked about, it's actually just like, oh, actually this exists and this happens already, and how do we communicate that and to say, like, you could be part of, somebody's solution. So whether that's temporary or not, like, that's like, everybody could be part of the solution somehow. I think there's a parallel when you think about things that are not in people's periphery. I mean, I have done years and years of work around creating safety in the trans community back home in Thunder Bay, and being a part of the community myself. Anybody who hadn't had an experience or realized that being transgender or being non-binary or on the spectrum of gender was a thing, or it wasn't part of, no one in their family had experienced that, they hadn't heard about it. There's lots of people that just hadn't heard about it. And so when you introduce this new topic that, obviously kind of goes against, that ingrained social nature of what we all kind of grew up with, then it's often met with resistance and in a similar way, when people are like, well, just get a job, or just, this is how you solve your housing problem, just do this, just do that, then yeah, you're met with resistance and solutions on how you can solve the problem. So I think there's definitely parallels that we can take from the which ways people have overcome different discrimination and barriers that we got to get creative. To me, it really does connect with coordinated access because it's about finding the right resource and placing the person to the resource that's needed. And so, if this became another resource, how beautiful would that be to start looking at the people that are looking for housing and matching them to the proper resource, whether that be house sharing or whether that be um, social housing or long-term care or just regular permanent market housing. There's a spectrum of need, and I think it would just be amazing if this was one of them. So, I mean, I think Nova Scotia is no stranger to newcomers, and I think when we talk about um, marginalized or even equity-seeking groups or equity-deserving groups, then yeah, there's all these other layers of intersecting ways in which people experience discrimination when trying to find housing. So, um, you know, we might have each person might have a traditional thought of what the struggles of finding housing would be, but then you add on the fact that someone might be new to Canada, or it might be a family that is having a baby in Canada, but they're not from Canada, and all the struggles that come along with trying to find the resources available to that, or people that are returning to Nova Scotia from other parts of the country and no longer have the resources to buy a house because the housing prices are so high. Like there's so many numerous ways in which people can find themselves housing insecure, and I think um, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, um, like I said, there's so many layers in which people can experience discrimination. So when I think about like queer youth, our community in Cumberland has been working for a long time to create a youth space. And so at Maggie's Place, which is a family resource center, they have the Youth Development Center. And so that was born out of many years of trying to get that established, and in ways that they support youth across a lot of different spectrum, whether it be newcomer, queer youth, um, um, youth from other minority populations or Indigenous youth. There's all these different ways in which that resources was created to support those youth. But I think that like any organization or any work that's being done, there needs to be a consultative process where we're asking community and we're asking people from those communities to participate in building those pieces. And so I'll say the Nova Scotia Nonprofit Housing Association, it's built on the values of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And so one thing that our board has really tried to do is include those values in every step of the way, everything that we're doing. So creating our website, is it universal design learning enabled? Will we have the ability to add other accessible functions as time goes on and we have more functionality in our website? Are the colors of our logo accessible? Do we have people from all those different communities participating at the board? Like all of these things are really, really important to do any kind of work, especially when we talk about decolonization. And so I think that there's room for all of that at the table when we're looking at housing. And it's already a complicated issue, but it's not going to get any better unless we're actually asking those voices. My experience is, being from Thunder Bay, Ontario, where it's a hub community for so many different Indigenous groups. Whether they're part of a treaty or there's untreated reserves as well that don't have the same rights as others, which often go without for a lot of resources. Thunder Bay is a big hub for all of those communities, as well as a hub for newcomers, as well as a hub for queer people in northwestern Ontario, and in a lot of the ways in which Thunder Bay has become quite diverse. It rhymes. It rhymes with a lot of different places. Being its position from Toronto, everything north of Barrie doesn't matter and doesn't get funding, right? There's a lot of things that rhyme, whereas you don't see as much investment in Cumberland County that you do in other areas, and same with Cape Breton and down in Bridgewater, Yarmouth, South Shore. Like you're not seeing the same level of investment that you do in HRM, given that HRM is a major city and has an acute amount of homelessness and issues. But um, you know, for population, a lot of these issues are still happening everywhere across the province. And so I think that um, it's interesting that HRM is often separated out of other work in the province, when I think that there could be room for lessons learned in HRM to also be shared with rural areas, but also vice versa, where rural learnings can be passed to HRM. I think that in Cumberland, some people really feel it and see it. I mean, homelessness was not as visible 3 years ago, during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic. It wasn't as visible with people in tents, or people being kicked out of, squatting in dilapidated houses, or even just being on the street and wandering the streets all day and night. So that wasn't visible in Cumberland County and in the town of Amherst. So, last year, I think the police received 130 calls last summer about homelessness in a month. And that's a lot for a town of just over 10,000 people. And so I think that people are becoming more and more aware of it, because it's showing up in different ways, and in those more traditional ways, seeing tents and seeing people huddled in doorways of businesses, or like backs of dumpsters and things like that. Like, that's always existed in Cumberland County, but the higher visibility, the more that people are starting to recognize that there is a housing crisis. And people that can afford to buy a home, or people that can afford to do a lot more than just survive, um, you know it's not an urgency for them. So you can almost understand in a certain way why people who don't have to worry about housing don't think about the housing crisis. But at the same time, and it's not to say that those people aren't compassionate and empathetic people, but because it's not part of their daily, then it's kind of not in the periphery. So putting it in front of people, and putting the housing crisis in the news, and putting the housing crisis into people's lives, really does change how people start to think about it. We had such a backlash last winter. We had a winter emergency temporary shelter put in at a church in a residential neighborhood in Amherst. And there was a lot of backlash and a lot of concerns from the neighborhood. I was part of the organizing committee that got it going. And our MLA, Elizabeth Smith McCrossan, was very instrumental in getting that group started and getting it going. And the Cumberland Homelessness and Housing Support Association hosted the shelter that we eventually got. But the amount of backlash that was from the neighborhood, people were threatening to list their houses and move. People were leaving garbage on the front step. People were really, really upset, and that is the first time Amherst has ever had a shelter. And so there's still lots of education and lots of work to be done. As much as people know the presence of what YMCA of Cumberland does in our office, it's only started in 2017, and so people are aware of the services we provide, but homelessness hadn't been like right in their face in the same way. And so a lot of people were scared, and they didn't understand. So there's just always room for education, for people to learn about what's actually happening. But it's hard when it's not part of their daily.